I'll be right back. We happy end, guys?
Yes! Yes!
The finale of Final Fantasy month is here, and to end this month once and for all is to count down all 15 of the main entries in the Final Fantasy series. With Final Fantasy 16 announced over a year ago, we need to do this. Also, keep this in mind, when I say main series, I just mean the original 15. So no sequels to the sequel, remakes and remasters, and definitely no spin-offs. Just the original 15 games ranking from worst to best. Alright, let's just get started to finish this month once and for all. Final Fantasy XIV is clearly known as the worst MMORPG, and heck, many gamers call FF14 one of the worst games of all time. Now, some might argue that this shouldn't count as a main series entry since it is an MMORPG and not a JRPG. Hey, it's a numbered entry, isn't it? So 14 and 11 qualify for the list. The biggest reason why this game failed was that it was unfinished. Got so many terrible reviews, and so Square Enix had to shut down the game and restart anew with one of the absolute greatest video game moments of all time.
As I was saying, it's got a 54 giga. Get your hand away from that button!
You will kill us all if you touch that button! Sorry, won't happen again.
I'm a fire in the laser!
In Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn was made and was much better than what the original had to offer. Final Fantasy XIV is clearly known as Square Enix's worst game of all time, and it might be for many years. And this was when Final Fantasy XIII was released in North America, in the same year. Speaking of which... Yeah, I have Final Fantasy XIII on the bottom half of my list. Now just remember, I'm not ranking these by least favorite to favorite, because I have only played 3 Final Fantasy games ever released. Final Fantasy XIII may be a game I used to hate and now love, but due to other people's perspectives, it was overhyped and disappointing. I have pretty much said nearly all of the problems in the top 10 worst Final Fantasy games, and other problems I mentioned are in other videos on my countdowns and on my second channel. But I'll mention the problems I never mentioned in other videos, so if you want to check out the problems of FF13, check out these videos. And this is honestly the 3rd biggest issue I have with this game, and I never mentioned it in other videos. If the character you're playing as dies, you lost. Seriously, you would never believe how many times I lost battles because the enemies always go for me. I still like this game, but due to the critic reviews and gamer reviews, Final Fantasy XIII will stand as the Final Fantasy game people love to hate. I have talked about Final Fantasy II on the PSP on the worst Final Fantasy games list. Higher than Final Fantasy XIII, but the PlayStation Portable version wasn't the original version. The original FF2 was released on the Famicom in 1988, and to be honest, this is one game that is either loved or hated by the fanbase. Yeah, Final Fantasy 2 is heavily flawed, and that's why FF2 is higher than 13 and 14. Just like FF13, FF2 requires a heck ton of mandatory grinding, but it doesn't seem as bad as it does in 13. This game's conversation system is honestly the worst in every retro Final Fantasy game. Sometimes when you talk to someone, it requires you to memorize something or ask for information. Dude, that's stupid! If I want information on something, I'd look on Google instead. In 2001, the game Squaresoft announced to be released for the PlayStation 2 was a Final Fantasy game with actual voice acting, and it looks amazing. However, for some people, that game was disappointing, and that game was none other than Final Fantasy X. Along with FF2, 10 is considered either one of the best or the worst Final Fantasy games out there. And while Final Fantasy X isn't at least one of the worst Final Fantasy games ever made, it is still considered one of the worst main entry FF games. But hey, if FF10 is one of your favorite games in the main series, that's good for you. The music is beautiful, and is probably the best music library in video game history. Characters like Auron, Lulu, Jack, and Yuna are completely likable. In fact, FF10 is some of my favorite groups in FF history, and this is some of the best graphics on the PS2. So what are the problems people have with this game? The game has a very linear hallway structure, has a somewhat decent story but is very confusing, and the main character is completely unlikable. Yeah, this game shares a ton of similarities to Final Fantasy XIII, but 10 kinda does better. After the best-selling entry in the series, Final Fantasy VII, people were hoping what the 8th main series entry will bring, and what things will improve from it. People weren't expecting these things when it was released in 1999. Now then, I prefer this game over 7, but objectively, 8 is worse. It's not terrible by any means, but everything except the CGI animated cutscenes and the music got nerfed. Graphics, something I call pixel dated. Games that have been pixelated and the pixels are so outdated. Party members, great, but some are unlikable, such as Irvine, Selfie, Squall, and Renoa, but I still like them either way. Story, dark and great, but obs a step down from FF7. Battle system, sometimes easy, sometimes hard. It is known as the easiest Final Fantasy game ever, and I played the remastered version on Nintendo Switch, which is my second favorite Final Fantasy game of all time, even if the multiple difficulty curves in this game say otherwise.
To be honest, there's not that much many.
This game is also home to one of the best intros in gaming history and the best battle systems in the series. Fantastic main antagonists, and some of the best moments in gaming. Especially the ending, even if it is mind-boggling. You know, to be perfectly honest, if Final Fantasy III was released on the Nintendo DS first, I'd have definitely put this game higher on the list. But for now, Final Fantasy III stays only on the number 10 spot. Same with Final Fantasies 1 and 2, Final Fantasy III was released on the Famicom exclusively in Japan. FF3 is a game that is well received in Japan and is one of the best Final Fantasy games in that country. However, nobody else got FF3 until 2006 when it was remade on the DS. Okay, if this is considered to be one of the best in the main series, then why is this game only on number 10? Despite 3 being a great game, it still has flaws. Heavy flaws that make not many people like the game. The characters are considered to be the most bland and uninteresting roster ever, an unoriginal villain that is somehow worse than X-Step, and every time you change jobs, your stats decrease. Now, then gameplay is similar to other Final Fantasies, and objectively, story is not the worst in the main series, worst being 2, 8, 10, 12, and 13. but it is honestly one of the most forgettable out of the series. Still, I want to play it, the DS remake, but the Famicom version was overshadowed by its DS counterpart, so what's even the point of playing it if it's exclusively in Japan? The Famicom version, I mean. Okay, from now on, all games on this list are Final Fantasies that are critically acclaimed in Marvel Steam. Final Fantasy X was not the only FF game on the PS2. One we'll get to later, but for now, let's talk about Final Fantasy XII, a main series game that was released in 2006, the year that Final Fantasy XIII and Final Fantasy Versus 13 were in development. Final Fantasy XII is one of the most mixed opinionated and polarizing games in the Final Fantasy series. For Final Fantasy XII, you got 3 different categories. Some people think it is one of the best, some people think it is one of the worst, and the reason why FF12 lands at number 9, there are people who think it is both good and bad. Now then, again, I'm not ranking these games due to my experience. I'm ranking these games due to how critically acclaimed these games are. Anyway, let's move on. While there are fantastic things about the game, like the graphics, characters, and the story even, 12 is known for having some of the most cruddiest moments in the series, like the boss battles such as the Elder Worm and
Aliens.
4 hours again?
Again?
that guy. And while the story was good at times, Final Fantasy XII had some very unmemorable moments. The voice acting was sort of atrocious. Now then, I freaking love British accents, but this? Okay, it's somewhat decent. One of the biggest hit or miss aspects about 12 was the gameplay itself, which pretty much takes the ATB strategies from the rest of the series and combines it in an MMORPG sort of style gameplay, except it's more single than multi. So yeah, there are many great things about 12, and I'm pretty much planning on getting Final Fantasy XII The Zodiac Age on Switch sometime. Let's rewind back to 2006. You are watching a trailer for the newest Final Fantasy game, known as Final Fantasy Versus 13. You're seeing this emo man dodging and blocking every single one of the soldier's bullets and slicing them all down, and he sits atop a throne. You want that game so bad, but you heard that it was getting delayed. Until 2013, when Square Enix decided to rename it Final Fantasy 15, going to start from scratch. So, after constant delays, Final Fantasy 15 was released late 2016. 10 years later, its first announcement. That'll do? Great. The reason why this game is only on my 8th spot is how some people say it was one of the most disappointing games they have played, and yeah, 15 had parts of it that weren't good. Adamant toys! But still, 15 looks good. Seriously, look at these visuals. This is one of the best looking video games on the PS4 and looks like a game released in 2010. Oh wait, it was released in development during that time. Square! The plot contained a prince called Noctis, where he and his bros, Gladiolus, Ignis, and Prompto, go searching for Noctis' longtime friend Luna Freya, who they haven't seen since they were kids. Seriously, the mass of content. You can go driving in a car with your bros, sit at a campfire, ride chocobos, all just to find one girl. And his adventure continues 10 years when he and his bros can become older. The music was beautiful and yet highly unmemorable. Has some of the greatest party members in all of Final Fantasy and the gameplay. If you have a look at this, it's like Final Fantasy VI, Need for Speed Rivals, and Devil May Cry as one game. The FF15 takes more on a hack and slash and RPG elements that still makes this game a true Final Fantasy game. Now then, with this and the Final Fantasy VII Remake finally out, Square Enix needs to finish Final Fantasy 16. Come on, Square, it's been literally over a year since we last heard from it. Don't delay it longer than you did Final Fantasy 15, otherwise you guys will be the king of delays. Some might argue that this isn't the best Final Fantasy game on the PS2, but just please respect where I put these entries. Anyways, number 7 is Final Fantasy 11. I can already tell heads are scratching, but still, an MMORPG taking the top spot as the best PlayStation 2 Final Fantasy game? Yeah, that's weird to me as well, but guess what? I actually wanted to put Final Fantasy X in the top 5. No exaggeration. But due to the flack that game gets, I had no choice but to put it that low. There is not really much to say about Final Fantasy 16 since, well, it's an MMORPG. It also introduced tiny people with fat faces and black noses. It's also got one of the hardest super bosses. It's got Shantoto. It's also got the most annoying salvage side of Starfire from Teen Titans Go.
Yes, do your worst and all that. Strong words will count for naught once I've crushed you flatter than flat.
That's really it I can say. Like I said, Final Fantasy 16 is an MMO, so there is not much I can say. However, if you want to play FF11, don't play it on consoles. All console servers have been shut down, and now the only way you can experience this is on PC. Good luck getting internet if you have it! When commenting on WatchMojo's top 10 Final Fantasy games list, I replied to a guy called Jordan3D. And when I said that Final Fantasy V was the black sheep of the series, he commented in the comment section saying how FF5 was the most quintessential FF game, and yeah, okay, I was wrong. Besides, shout out to Jordan3D for fixing my comment. But what I meant was that I didn't mean it's worse than 14, 13, 2, and 10. I meant that it's one of the least talked about FF games from how many videos I've seen, along with Final Fantasy 1, 2, 11, and 14. Final Fantasy V still was generally known as a great game by today's standards. Final Fantasy V did some things better than the original trilogy did, like the characters and the plot, but still did things worse. The main villain is a monologuing knight, and the music is highly unmemorable. More than the likes of 2, 11, 12, 14, and 15. Seriously, other than X-Death's theme, I rarely remember a single track. Final Fantasy V is honestly one of the greatest looking retro-style Final Fantasy games, along with the first 4 Final Fantasy games. Here's a true fact for those who never knew about this. Considering the first 3 games were made on the Famicom exclusively only in Japan, Square wanted to release Final Fantasy IV on the SNES, and was going to be the first FF outside of Japan. However, in North America, Square named Final Fantasy IV Final Fantasy II, and Final Fantasy VI was Final Fantasy III. Now you may be thinking, what happened to Final Fantasy V? Square skipped it. So technically Final Fantasy VI should have been Final Fantasy V instead. Just unfreaking believable. The year was 1988, and a company that goes by the name of Square created a game called Final Fantasy, released on the Famicom only in Japan. 4 legendary heroes embark on a quest to defeat and vanquish evil. 2 in particular, a black knight called Garland, the devilish monster Chaos, and the 4 fiends are out to destroy the world. That being said, the kingdom's princess is at another castle, and the entire kingdom is in danger. One warrior of light and many different strangers are out to vanquish the darkness, and save the princess from the terrors that are Chaos and Garland. Their roles as a job class need to be fulfilled, Many monsters need to be defeated and towns to save. This is one universe. Out of 14 more different universes, join them and experience the party's Final Fantasy. Am I done? Good. Choosing between which of the top 4 to take the top spot was so hard. These 4 are currently known as the bestest of the overall best. All of these are fan favorites and so critically acclaimed. All of you guys will call one of these of the top 4 to be the best of them all. But I've done it, and I will say that number 4, and the weakest of the best for my votes, is Final Fantasy IV. Oh, how surprising, eh? Final Fantasy IV is at number 4. What's a twist? Yeah, for better or worse. I find 4 to be the weakest of the great because, let's face it, the DS version is much better. But we're talking about the original SNES version, so let's hop to it. Just like with Final Fantasy III, 4 is the same but with animated cutscenes for the entry of FF3. To be honest, I did kind of compare both the Famicom and the DS version, and I'm sorry I did that, but let's do the same with this. Just because FF4 is the weakest of the greats, it's not a bad FF game. Seriously, FF4 has got an amazing story, interesting villains, and quite possibly the best protagonist this series has ever got. The graphics are great, the music is somewhat memorable, and turns out Golbez wasn't the main villain, but was controlled by the psychic manipulator Lunarian known as Zemus. In North America, you may think of this as Final Fantasy II, but the rest around the world, it's known as Final Fantasy IV. The first Final Fantasy game that makes it truly what a Final Fantasy game should have been, and it's the first Final Fantasy game to be released outside of Japan. You know, Final Fantasy VIII was not the only Final Fantasy game released on the original PlayStation. Before that, it was Final Fantasy VII, and after FF8 is the game some people consider to be the best Final Fantasy game and was the first Final Fantasy game ever in the 21st century. Final Fantasy IX. What can I say about Final Fantasy IX? Let's start this off by saying a few things. From Final Fantasy VII to Final Fantasy into modern times, Square decided to bring Final Fantasy IX back to the medieval days because, as you know, the first 6 Final Fantasy games were during the Kings and Queens era. Now let's talk about the characters. Zidane is my favorite character in the game. Garnet is a great fighter slash damsel in distress. Steiner makes me smile and is just so hilarious. Vivi is such a tragic black mage. Aiko, however, was a brat, and Quina was a completely random spot. Kuja is so poetic, disturbing, and so interesting. For a game released a year after Final Fantasy VIII, it has aged exponentially better than Final Fantasy VII and VIII ever did. Not only did 9 go back to the medieval times, but it also went back to using the job system. The job system was a thing that was introduced in the Final Fantasy series since day 1. But ever since Final Fantasy VII, they've somehow been removed. But Final Fantasy IX brought them back. Some of them include Thief, Black Mage, and White Mage. Final Fantasy IX had some pretty good cinematic cutscenes and it's not the only one of the more depressing and charming Final Fantasies, but it's also really funny. Thank you for the comic relief, Steiner. Most of you will apparently get a bit upset about this entry, and seeing that this is not number 1, so time for my final flame shield this month. the best retro Final Fantasy SNES JRPG considered by many known as Final Fantasy III only lands at number 2. What? This is Final Fantasy VI? Oh. I can understand the hatred right now, and seeing how some of you guys are mad seeing how FF6 is not number 1, well, just listen to my reasons for a minute. Final Fantasy VI is probably the most interesting and depressing storylines in all of gaming. The loss of Rachel, Celes' suicide attempt, and relationship between Lockhole and Celes share. There are just so many emotions in the story, and this is probably the first Final Fantasy game that actually made us care for all the characters. I mean really, every character has something to offer. Terra, the main protagonist, has been brainwashed by Kefka's empire. Locke is a treasure hunter and thief who lost Rachel, the girl he loves. Celes was the general of Kefka's empire, betrayed him and formed a relationship with Locke. Edgar is the biggest flirt master. Strago was an interesting old-timer. Rel may be a brat like Aiko, but hey, if you could put up with her, then good for you. And the antagonist of the game. Mr. Clownface aka Kefka Palazzo just steals the entire show. He is hilarious, wisecracking, disturbing, and one of the very few villains in gaming who actually succeeds before the heroes get a chance to. He is easily the best Final Fantasy villain to this very day. And the retroness. For a game on the Super Nintendo, this game looks gorgeous and has aged so well to this very day. FF6 is home to some fantastic moments in the series, and will be held as one of the best Super Nintendo RPGs to this very day. Now then, no game is perfect. Every game has its flaws. I used to think Super Mario Galaxy was the closest, but after examining it closer, I now think Final Fantasy VI is the closest to perfection. One problem being the American version of the SNES cartridge where you use one of Realm's spells on a certain enemy in a certain place. The game will start glitching and freaking out, and some cartridges have even been ruined due to it. Now that is one problem, but even then Final Fantasy VI is one game I would call the game that is almost perfect. You guys can call me Mr. Overrated if you want, but you guys had to admit, you had to see this one coming. While this game is my least favorite of all the Final Fantasy games I played, I don't hate it. While it's not as flawless as 6, this game brought Final Fantasy to the map, and is the most important Final Fantasy game. What am I talking about? I think I'll let the music introduce you to it. What a fantastic final entry to end off Final Fantasy month, by talking about the best of the overall best of the best. Final Fantasy VII.
Oh, Cammy, why is this higher than Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy 9?
Alright, while 6 may be the better game in the series, Final Fantasy VII revolutionized 3D JRPGs and brought the Final Fantasy franchise to the map. Seriously, this was a huge step from FF6, going from a retro art style game to a 3D polygonal JRPG we know and love to this day. One thing I noticed about Final Fantasy VII is that gamers tend to bash this game for being too overrated and being outdated. Alright, sure, maybe 7 is a bit overrated, and yeah, the graphics are dated, but this was still the early years of 3D gaming, can't really blame that. And the characters. I mentioned before and I'll say it again, the characters are amazing. In fact, I even like some of the weaker characters like Aerith and Yuffie. Tetsuya Nomura really stepped up his game. In fact, as you know, we now have a Final Fantasy VII Remake on PlayStation 4 this year. And while it is kinda close to being better than the original, I still wanna play the FF7 Remake so bad. And that wraps up Final Fantasy month, everyone. Did you like this month? If so, tell me in the comments below and what your favorite countdown was this month. If you are a Final Fantasy fan and have watched all 6 of my countdowns, my 2 reviews, my CVGMs and SVGMs on all 3 of my channels, then you Final Fantasy fans join me S-Time Club, even if you love or hate the character of Hope S-Time. Now, I'm User1 Campbell, and thanks for watching this glorious month.